For as long as most of you have been alive, we have been told that federal debt is a major crisis just waiting to happen. For more than a quarter of a century at this point, we've become very well acquainted with the images of this debt clock and the increasingly regular government shutdowns where they play hot potato with this ballooning hand grenade. If all of that wasn't annoying enough, there is almost the uniform flip-flop between politicians taking turns to be very concerned about fiscal responsibility depending on if they are in or out of power at that time.
I believe we are finally putting America on the path towards fiscal reform and fiscal responsibility.
Republicans in Congress raised the debt 3 times when Donald Trump was president, and each time with Democrat support.
Would anybody ever use that to negotiate with? They said absolutely not. That's a sacred, created, he doubled the debt.
It's a powerful message, but they do seem to forget about it pretty quickly once they are in office, and fixing it would require actual sacrifice. And if we are being honest with ourselves, it's almost easy to see where this indifference is coming from. We were told we were at an inflection point when we crossed $10 trillion in debt, and then $20 trillion, and now we are approaching $40 trillion in debt, or 130% of our GDP. The rate in which we are taking on new debt is also accelerating. Almost half of all of our outstanding borrowing has been done in just the last 6 years. And yet, on the surface, you would be forgiven for thinking, not much has changed. And I don't just mean that in the sense of, why haven't we turned into Greece yet? Because this also raises a more important question. The government has spent $15 trillion more than it has brought in taxes in just the last half-decade alone. So why don't we feel $15 trillion richer? When will this debt actually become a problem?
It's a record-breaking number that fiscal watchdogs are not celebrating. The United States debt surpassed $38 trillion.
The federal government is headed towards a shutdown Friday, and Democrats and Republicans are still battling over a deal to keep it open.
The government shutdown is now the second longest federal funding lapse in modern history.
So we are paying today more from the federal budget to just service the debt, the interest that we pay on the debt, right? It's at 20% of the budget. That's a huge number.
Okay. So the federal government has a massive amount of debt that has really only been trending in one direction, and there are ultimately only 6 options we have to deal with it. We can grow our way out of it, we can inflate our way out of it, we can raise taxes, cut spending, turn into Japan, or continue to kick the can down the road. So far, politicians have been promising this first option, while overwhelmingly relying on this last option, and it's important to understand the fundamentals of why we can't keep on doing this. Because it's worked out pretty well for us so far, right? As of the time of making this video, the USA has never defaulted on its debt repayments, although it has gotten shockingly close on an increasingly frequent number of occasions. But to be fair, a lot of these near misses were crises of our own creation. It sounds dumb, and to be honest, it is dumb. But not many people actually understand the real mechanics of, well, how this money actually works. You may be under the misconception that the national debt has been ticking up every second of every day since we last ran our budget surplus back in 2002. Sensationalist media reporting and iconography like this debt clock certainly haven't helped with that understanding. But as an example, our national debt actually shrunk ever so slightly between Q4 of 2024 and Q2 of 2025. This was because prior to this, the debt ceiling was suspended, effectively taking the self-imposed cap off how much the government could borrow. When that suspension ended on the 1st of January 2025, the debt ceiling came back into effect and the government found itself already at its credit limit. To fill this gap, the government mostly just used the money it had sitting around in the Treasury General account. There are some technicalities, but really this is effectively just the checking account for the federal government. It's a big bank account held with the Fed that taxes and other federal receipts like tariffs go into, and all of the expenses of the government, including debt repayments, come out of. The Treasury Department releases a daily report of everything that goes into this account and everything that comes out of it, so you are welcome to balance the government's checkbook. Currently, there is over $900 billion sitting in this account, a near record high outside of major events around the pandemic. When the debt ceiling was reintroduced last year and we temporarily couldn't expand the debt, we spent down this account from just over $800 billion to less than $300 billion over 6 months, including a bit of a boost from April tax receipts. Today, the debt ceiling has been increased again to $41.1 trillion, after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act added $5 trillion to our credit limit back in July last year. In the 3 months that followed that, we had already added an additional $1.4 trillion to the debt, with some of this extra money going towards topping this account back up. Now, it's important to understand these basic financial mechanics, because one of the most immediate risks that lenders are afraid of is what happens if the government doesn't raise the debt ceiling and we run out of money in this account. We have actually come incredibly close 3 times in just the last 15 years. In 2011, there was political brinkmanship over reducing the deficit. In 2013, it was the same threat used to push back against the Affordable Care Act. And in 2023, Congress once again demanded a cutback in government spending, or else it would refuse to lift the limit. At the climax of the standoff, the Treasury had less than $40 billion left in its account. Even after taking extraordinary measures like delaying payments towards pension accounts, there was less than 48 hours of regular spending before the Treasury just simply wouldn't have anything left to fund the government or pay back its lenders. Now, threatening to push the government into default in the name of fiscal responsibility is a little bit like refusing to pay back your credit card because you are starting a new budget. The real reason the government plays this dumb game so much is because it's a good way for Congress to threaten the president. These stunts have had real consequences, because while theoretically the US can technically always cover its debt by printing more of its own money, we have demonstrated that we might eventually choose not to over political squabbles. The longer we can keep kicking the can down the road, the more dangerous these games become. Shaking the Jenga tower gets riskier and riskier the higher we stack it. Playing chicken with a debt half the size of our GDP wasn't a great idea to begin with. Playing the same games with the debt level we have today has had real consequences even if it wasn't an outright collapse. Following the standoff in 2023, our credit rating was downgraded by Fitch from a perfect AAA to a AA+, meaning that federal borrowing was no longer seen as completely risk-free, and since then we have only been downgraded further still. To put things into perspective, US federal debt is now rated similarly or even lower than a lot of mortgage-backed securities were back in 2007, which obviously sounds bad. But it's time to learn how money works to find out why this hasn't become a crisis yet, and how we could fix it before it does. If you're sitting there thinking, okay, so who actually benefits when a system stays broken? Then this free report from The Hustle basically answers that question. It's called the Billionaire's Resource Playbook, and it's a decoder ring for how ultra-wealthy people buy influence without buying the obvious stuff. It breaks down 5 ways influence gets accumulated through assets you don't really notice, like obscure laws, geographical choke points, land swaps, regulatory loopholes, and security premiums that quietly turn into leverage. What I like is that it doesn't just point at the magic trick. It shows you the wiring. You get the real case studies, the mental models behind the moves, and then an ethical version of the playbook you can actually use as an individual, a community, or an entrepreneur. So if you've ever wondered why the loud arguments are about yachts while the real power gets built somewhere off screen, this is the map. Grab the free report using the link in the description, the Billionaire's Resource Playbook. And thanks to The Hustle for sponsoring this video. So the actual risk of people holding US debt never getting their money back is effectively zero, because at the end of the day, we can ask the Fed to just print more cash. But even a small pause in repayments is an indication that the government might not have this whole situation under control. And since so many systems in the global economy rely on using treasuries as effectively an immutable cash flow generator, any uncertainty casts doubt over a lot more than just getting an interest payment a few days late. The risk to bondholders is not that they won't get the money back that they were promised. Even if it is delayed, they will get their money back. The real risk is that by the time they do, the money they receive won't be worth it anymore, either because it's been inflated away or because nobody wants to use US dollars anymore. If treasuries can't be relied on as the foundation of global financial plumbing, that is just one thing that could undermine the expected future value. Another risk is that US dollars themselves won't be in demand if America becomes a less dominant middleman in the global economy. Which, well, I mean, yeah, that's clearly not an unfounded concern. All these potential future problems means that lenders want to see higher returns to compensate them for these risks. When the Treasury borrows money, it effectively runs a reverse auction. It says it needs a certain amount of money and promises a higher and higher rate until people agree to give them that money. In recent months, as more groups have been looking to diversify away from the increasingly questionable dollar, these auctions have gone on for a lot longer than we have been used to, and we have had to offer a lot more interest than we did in the past, on top of interest rates that have also risen. As more and more of our debt is rolled over onto these higher rates, the total amount of money that we are dedicating just to covering interest has almost tripled within the last 5 years alone. And unfortunately, that in turn presents a risk to investors who want even higher rates to compensate them for risks posed by higher interest rates. We have actually spent a similar portion of our GDP on interest payments in the past, but that was back in the 1980s when interest rates were as high as 19%. The only thing that made this possible was the fact that our total debt was a lot lower. so even a much higher rate didn't cost as much as today. The total debt burden that we are carrying around now means that just a 1% increase in interest rates will carve more than 1% of our GDP in repayments. If we really are just going to try and kick the can down the road, the number one most important thing we can do is to make sure that road is as smooth as possible. But since we seem utterly incapable of doing that, maybe we should explore some other options. The best option would be to grow our way out of the debt, and politicians in particular love this idea because it is theoretically the option that requires the least sacrifice. If you have $20,000 of credit card debt and you make minimum wage, well, that's a major problem. But the same debt for someone making $250,000 a year is much less of a concern. By working off that same basic assumption, if we grow our economy faster than the debt, we can keep things under control. The reason this is such a popular idea is because economic growth is an objective in the first place, and if it lets us handwave away another problem, that is even better. No politician really wants to run on the idea of sacrifice in hard times, so they go full Wolf of Wall Street and propose dealing with your problems by getting rich. Now, to be fair, our debt to GDP ratio has actually shrunk over the last 5 years from a pandemic high of 132% down to about 121% today. It's still not great, but it is at least showing that the economy is growing faster than the debt, right? Well, yes, that's actually true. But there are 3 problems with this simple assumption. The first is that we are measuring economic growth and debt from the starting point of the pandemic when the economy was locked down and we took out massive loans to fund big stimulus programs. The second is that by zooming out and observing a more long-term trend, it becomes clear that outside of this little anomaly, we are still overwhelmingly trending in the wrong direction. And finally, this is just measuring the total debt, not how much we actually need to pay on it. To use the same analogy again, $20,000 in credit card debt is a lot worse than a $20,000 mortgage, and that's because of the interest rate. Because lenders are demanding higher rates from the Treasury in conjunction with a higher cash rate from the Fed, we are now paying around 4% of our GDP in interest payments alone. A 4% GDP growth rate would be considered extremely good, and we would need to achieve that every year, year after year, just to compensate for the interest payments now. In reality, since the year 2000, we have actually achieved an average annual growth rate of around 3%, and compared to a lot of other countries, we are actually doing pretty well. So with this much money going to interest alone, just growing our way out of the debt ain't going to cut it anymore. Another option is something that actually seems pretty logical. Fire up the money printers and inflate our way out of it. Treasuries have a nominal face value, and most have fixed interest rates, with only the exception of a measly $2 trillion worth of outstanding inflation-protected securities. If we have the value of our money, we could effectively half the value of our debt. If you took out $1 million fixed interest loan in Zimbabwe before hyperinflation, you would have been able to turn around a year later, sell a loaf of bread, and pay off your debt 1,000 times over with the proceeds. Now, it doesn't need to go that far, but if we let our inflation run higher than average for a few years, it could bring down the real value of this debt. The problem is that this only really works once. To lenders, this is almost the same thing as default. Remember, their only real risk is that the money they get back from holding these bonds isn't worth what they were expecting it to be when they bought it. Sustained inflation would help to reduce the burden of the current outstanding bonds we have, but next time the Treasury goes to borrow more money, investors are going to demand even higher rates to compensate them for the falling value of the dollar over time. Higher than expected inflation compared to other economies could also further undermine the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Not to mention, wreak havoc on regular people who are already suffering from a cost of living crisis. The inflate away our problems by just printing more money does sound simple in theory, but it will almost certainly do more harm than good. So, that only leaves us with some of the less fun paths forward. The simplest solution of all would be to do what anybody would suggest if you have a debt problem. Make more money and spend less of what you make. In government speak, raise taxes and cut spending. Now, we tried to cut back in spending starting around this time last year, and overall, it did not go great. Unfortunately, a lot of our spending is not discretionary. So without fundamentally reshaping the rules around pensions or healthcare, the government can't directly control how much it spends in these categories. Outside of that, the largest expense category is just the interest on our debt, and without defaulting, we are stuck with that too. The military is the next big expense, and this is something we could change. But there are 2 problems with that, especially right now. The first problem is that we have actually increased our military spending as we have simultaneously decided to become more isolationist and interventionist at the same time. Now, we don't need another armchair general, but the second problem is something much more within our wheelhouse. Military recruitment is way up, which may be a sign of people wanting to do their patriotic duty. But it also may be a sign that young people, and in particular young men, couldn't find a job anywhere else. Cutting military funding right now could expose some major holes in other parts of the economy.
We're investing that record number of dollars, have no choice, in the United States Armed Forces. Also creating a lot of jobs, but we're not even doing it for that reason.
So, alright, maybe we just raise taxes, right? The One Big Beautiful Bill was one of the largest sweeping tax cuts ever, especially for higher income earners and asset owners, so that probably wasn't a step in the right direction down this particular path. But would it even matter? Total federal receipts, as in how much the government receives in tax and all other forms of revenue, as a share of GDP, has been remarkably consistent since the end of the Second World War. Even during the 50s and 60s, when we were taxing top income earners as much as 90%, the total revenue we brought in was comparatively identical to today. The problem is, since then and now, the spending of the federal government has almost doubled. We just have more programs, commitments, and expenses, so this data does on the surface support the idea that taxes alone aren't going to fix this, right? Well, that is true, but it's often used to redirect away from the issue of taxation entirely. We still tax comparatively little compared to most of our economic peers, and who is paying those taxes has changed considerably even if the end result has stayed consistent over time. According to IRS statistics, the burden of this revenue has shifted largely onto middle-income earners and away from wealthy asset owners. These are very taxing taxes that impact people with the highest propensity to spend, work, and reinvest when possible, which means this tax shift is likely also shifting the very same economic growth that we are still hoping could grow us out of our problems. On the flip side, a lot of the extra government spending that we are doing is flowing more directly to private enterprises through grants, contracts, credits, subsidies, bailouts, rebates, partnerships, and guarantees. That additional spending going to private institutions is captured and passed along to private shareholders. Of course, this still happened in the past, but the rate at which it is happening has increased. The economist Richard Vague has actually tracked this data and found an almost perfect inverse relationship between net government spending and net household income, with an increasing share of that income going to the top percentiles. So these asset owners have benefited from an increase in government spending while simultaneously contributing less to overall stagnant government revenue. This is a lot of words to say what you probably already knew, which is that wealthy asset owners and companies can afford to pay more taxes, which should help to bridge this widening gap and potentially take some pressure off workers who have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Put even more simply, we know that wealthy institutions and individuals can afford to finance our current budget deficit, because they already are financing our budget deficit. Through their investment funds, depository institutions, or just private holdings, these groups are collectively by far the largest net purchasers of government debt, with the exception of open market operations by the Fed and intra-government debt. If they can find the money to purchase bonds, they can find the money to pay taxes. Now, the final road that we could go down is ending up like Japan. Low growth, low inflation, and low interest rates to safely contain a volatile pool of debt. This is clearly not ideal, especially for asset owners that won't get to enjoy the line going up year after year on average, but it could be a last-ditch parachute to avoid a wider crisis in the meantime. Now, of course, the tragic reality is that we aren't going to do any of this until we have no other options, because it's easier and far more popular to just make the future someone else's problem. But go and watch this video next to find out how it also became a lot more profitable. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.